Welcome to another conversation with Larry Balkin, a Mind's Eye View Publishing bonus audio exclusive. We're talking today with Larry Balkin, the author of the recently released Jarboy and Other Tales of the Supernatural. In this rare interview, Larry shares his influences, how he began writing for the science fiction and horror pulp magazines, and how his experience as a magician and mentalist helped shape his stories. In addition, Larry discusses the concept of the trickster archetype and how he employs that in his eerie and often disturbing stories and poems. Join us now for another conversation with Larry Balkin. Larry, tell us a little about how you first began writing and how long it was before you were first published.
Well, before we begin, let me first say I want to thank you, Lauren Tyndall, for publishing this book and bringing it to the light of day. And it's been a marvelous experience working with you. And to answer your question, well, I began in high school as a teenager with the literary magazine, that type of thing. And I didn't really realize there was much of a market at that time for science fiction, horror, ghost stories. My favorite always being anything that had to do with the supernatural, paranormal. And I got started then at that tender young age, but hadn't really found the voice that I was going to later be writing in. And that wasn't until around 1973, when I was 23 years old. I had written a play called The Western Hero, with the same title as the same title as the story in the collection, and it was at that time was a play in 9 scenes, that particular story. And what I had done was I had wanted to, or actually, the play began writing itself, and I began discovering that what I was doing was writing a kind of ritual Western, surreal Western, something that really hadn't been done before, as far as I know, anywhere. And movies, plays, stories, not in the form that I was working in. That's why the short story itself has kind of a ritual structure and kind of a dramatic dialogue structure, oftentimes more than many of the other stories in the book. At that time, I was, as I say, I was 23 years old, and it kind of opened up the floodgates for me to pursue that type of supernatural, paranormal kind of story. It was something that I emotionally was attracted to, and worked in from then on. The play itself did get produced at a number of small theaters during the 1970s, and then later in the early 80s, when I became more and more involved with paranormal science fiction type of writing, I converted the play into a prose form, short story form, which later became published in the 1980s in a science fiction magazine out of New York City called Space and Time. And it's always been a story that's been dear to me, because it's kind of followed me throughout the last 43 years in one form or another.
So, Space and Time was the first magazine to publish you. How did you come to be published in other magazines?
Well, I began getting involved in the small press market at that time, and what that was about was, this is all right before, at the dawn of the computer, the personal computer. And there was no such thing as the internet for practical purposes at that time, at least for the great mass of readers and that sort of thing. You didn't have Amazon and all that, but there still were these pulp digest-sized magazines that circulated, that had their advertisements in various newsletters, and they would advertise in any of the science fiction magazines of the day. And so I just began submitting stories as I was writing them in the late 70s, early 80s to these smaller circulating magazines, although I would always pick the ones that paid, because I felt that if someone is willing to pay for your story, they must be at least worthy in their estimation to read it. And my motivation at that time was writing paranormal stories that I myself wanted to read. I would read a number of these magazines that would appear, and this type of pulp magazine had been around at least since the 1920s, since Amazing Stories came out in 1927. And I would be looking for a certain type of story, for example, and reading hundreds of short stories, and I wouldn't find it. And I'd think, yeah, I'd like to read a story about something about one of the subjects I was interested in, a surreal Western, or something that had to do with the old carnivals and 10 and ones. So I ended up writing that type of story myself. So that became my criteria for what type of story to write is the type of story I wanted to read. And these magazines fulfilled that need, and they paid what was called the old pulp rates of a half a cent a word, a penny a word, that kind of thing.
Who were some of your influences as a young writer?
The influences were genuine so-called real-life experiences. They were real-life emotional responses to those experiences. And also, in terms of literary influences, I found that I was fascinated by mainstream literature. I won't name anybody, but reading classics, mainstream literature was great, but I felt there was something missing for me emotionally. And it wasn't until I devoted more and more time to reading in the genre of the supernatural and the paranormal that things began to really come together. I realized this was at a very young age, in my teens, that this was the type of literature that spoke to me for whatever reason. And I really didn't. I analyzed it here and there, but never really came up with a satisfying answer as to why I was drawn to that. Part of it was probably because I was influenced by the literature of magicians and mentalists, mind readers, psychic readers, that sort of thing. Much of that was influential. The books that are written in those professions, many of those books are secret books. Many of those books are grimoires. Many of those books are privately circulated. And in terms of mainstream supernatural horror and literature, if I may use that phrase, of course I was influenced by Edgar Allan Poe, Lovecraft, Algernon Blackwood, Arthur Machen, and many others, modern writers in the various pulp magazines of the 70s and 80s. I would say just about everybody influenced me. Even stories that I read that I didn't think were very good. Sometimes I'd read a story and I'd think, I see what the writer was trying to accomplish, and the person's not a bad writer, but they didn't accomplish it. If you wanted to accomplish it, well, how would you make a story like that better? And so, by someone else's mistakes, as well as my own mistakes, which were many, I learned by doing.
One of my favorite stories in Jarboy is Lost Days, a story that deals with Edgar Allan Poe's final days. What kind of research did you do for that?
Well, in Lost Days, the Edgar Allan Poe story, I was working as a professional, full-time mentalist and magician, psychic reader, this sort of thing. I was fascinated by those subjects all my life. The time I was, long as I can remember, so probably before I was born. And I had always wondered about in the biographies I read of Edgar Allan Poe whatever happened to him in his last day or two, his so-called last lost days, and the biographers all speculated, but nobody knew. And so, as a magician, I came up with some ideas, and as a writer, fiction writer, I came up with the idea of lost days. And that particular story began taking form based on what I had as an intuitive theory of how Poe may have spent his last days. And the story took form in a magic routine, a conjuring routine known as bizarre magic. A script or routine grew out of that as well, one that I performed, and then later I went back and put some finishing touches on the short story, and they kind of fed each other. And it's the routine I performed was much like the short story, almost like the short story Lost Days is like almost like a play script itself. And what in terms of actual, that was the sort of intuitive research. In terms of literary research, I was influenced by a book came out in 1907 by a fellow named David P. Abbott, known as Behind the Scenes with the Mediums. And it's a book that many magicians know about, but few have read, and I became fascinated by that. Also, I named one of the characters in the story, gave her the last name of Reynolds, which in any biography of Poe will tell you that one of his last words before he died, Poe spoke the name Reynolds, but absolutely nobody knows who that might have been. and so that of course played with my imagination, and the story kind of wrote itself in that sense, as many of my stories do.
You've mentioned that you've worked as both a professional magician and a mentalist. How did you use this experience in your writing? I imagine it would have come in handy when writing stories like The Game of Thimbles and Spirit Cabinet.
Well, in the game of thimbles, I had, well, as a magician, I actually performed what was known as a thimble rigging or shell game type of routine in what I would call crooked gambling demonstrations, and I augmented that with my main gambling routine, which was the thimble rigging brother, which is known as three card Monte, which was also quite popular. It was a quite popular game or swindle on the steamboats, riverboats of the 19th century, both thimble rigging, three card Monte, and something else called Fast and Loose. And I was fascinated by those types of routines as a performer, and I would create my performing scripts from there. And every once in a while, my imagination would take off, and I'd begin wondering what would happen if something supernatural insinuated itself into my routine. What would that be? And I would just kind of leave that open to my intuition. And that's how the game of thimbles took form. I began wondering, well, what if I was doing thimble rigging or the shell game, and something started appearing both under the thimbles or shells or on the table? How would I react? What would I do? The uh, the um, the game of thimbles itself, interestingly enough, I wanted to write it with the language patterns of the 19th century. I don't do that in the westerns on purpose because I wanted them to be more of a modern language since they were kind of surreal. But in the game of thimbles, I wanted the language patterns to be very 19th century, so I patterned them on and was influenced by books such as The Expert at the Card Table, 1902 by S.W. Erdnase, and the book that I quote at the beginning of the story, Game of Thimbles, by George H. Duval, which is known as 40 Years a Gambler on the Mississippi. That also came out in the very early 20th century, around 1900 or so. I was influenced by that in that sense, and just kind of let my imagination go. And I would always ask myself, if I base the story on direct experience, which oftentimes I do base many of those stories on direct experience, I ask myself that what I consider to be the creative question, and that is, what would happen if the supernatural erupted, or the paranormal erupted somewhere in this event that I experienced. And sometimes it did. I mean, any magician, any writer of the paranormal does occasionally have direct experience with that kind of thing. And I'll use the words paranormal and supernatural interchangeably. Spirit Cabinet is based on two things. One is a Spirit Cabinet demonstration as portrayed in the story, and magicians, mentalists, entertainers of that kind, psychic entertainers, will refer to it, that presentation, as the Spirit Cabinet. People in the spiritualism world, such as the one character in the story, oftentimes refer to it as the black box, and I suppose there's other names as well. And what I do in that particular story is I have a theory based on an author by the name of George P. Hansen and his classic book, which I would like to see more read by people, known as The Trickster and the Paranormal. He talks about how oftentimes in real paranormal experiences, the paranormal, the supernatural itself, blurs the boundaries, and that's kind of how I felt the story should be written. That the boundaries should be blurred between what's going on. As some of it, the reader then asks the question: is some of what's going on here being manipulated, being faked? Is some of it real? Well, the truth is, it's both. What's happening in the Spirit Cabinet is a kind of betwixt and between a series of events which are real and unreal, and there's kind of a almost like a kind of fog, or there's not really a fine line. There's just kind of a gray area where where the paranormal erupts in that story, and so I base it both on genuine experience as a performer, and also as a student of various spiritual traditions, and also as a investigator and student of the paranormal. All of that is in the story, and the boundaries are slightly blurred, as I say, but that's intentional.
You wrote in an email that, and I'll quote you here, The atmosphere created by the nature of the trickster permeates the stories. Sometimes the atmosphere itself is the trickster, sometimes the literal ghost, and sometimes the characters. And sometimes the trickster is literal. Could you elaborate on the basic concept of the trickster and how it's brought into play in these stories?
Well, the way I see it is that the trickster is a kind of force, is a sort of energy that exists throughout history and all cultures, and especially in these types of stories, and comes in many forms. In Hanson's classic book, The Trickster and the Paranormal, he refers to it as a kind of constellation of characteristics. And what happens is these characteristics, which oftentimes include transition, disruption, that kind of thing, where things get things just kind of get inverted, and so on and so forth. Things become marginalized. There's blurrings of boundaries, crossing a boundary, and so on and so forth. What happens is that this kind of trickster, deceptive, duplicitous energy comes forth, and out of that, supernatural, paranormal phenomena of one sort or another kind of happens, sort of occurs. And the whole idea is that it's non-rational. Could seem irrational, but it's non-rational, and does not want to be labeled or categorized in any way. And so I explore that concept of the trickster, which can be manifested in an individual, like a court jester or something, can be manifested in a group, like an occult group, a UFO group, that kind of thing, or can be manifested in an entire culture when it breaks down and things become disruptive and transition happens. Like, for example, in the breakdown of the former Soviet Union, there was a plethora of reports of psychic phenomena happening around that time during those transitions. So I do see the trickster as a kind of energy that some situations and even people, individuals, mainline, if you will. For example, in the stories, the trickster energy plays a role, so as I say, sometimes in the atmosphere. For example, in the story Jackie, the atmosphere itself that the main character is involved in, it's hard for him to put his finger on what's tricking him, or if anything is tricking him, or who is the culprit, who's the trickster, what's the trickster, when the atmosphere, the whole thing is the trickster. It's sort of like the old thing where the ghost is not necessarily in the haunted house, the house itself is the ghost kind of concept. That's where the atmosphere comes in that particular story. And sometimes the ghosts in my stories are very literal, very traditional ghosts, such as in the story The Joker, or Ghost Town, where it's more a traditional kind of ghost story. And sometimes I see and then therefore the ghost is the trickster. Sometimes I see the trickster energy manifesting itself in the individuals, in the characters, and there's no traditional supernatural element there, but there's a hint of the supernatural. For example, in the story Jar Boy or Want Ad, they are not traditionally or overtly filled with supernatural events or atmosphere at all, but they're so close to it, so borderline, that there's kind of a feel that the trickster energy is there, and anything could happen. But the trickster energy is manifesting itself through the characters, through the individuals in the stories, rather than a ghost or the atmosphere. And sometimes, as you say, so-called real-life tricksters appear in the stories, particularly in stories such as The Game of Thimbles, Lost Days, Witchfinder General. In the Witchfinder General, there's literally a bar magician shows up to kind of move the main character into a certain direction that the fellow wants him to be moved. But that trickster energy is representing something else. It's more than just doing a trick. And in The Game of Thimbles, as I say before, I wanted to create a riverboat gambler, steamboat gambler, who was a trickster, but in a way, he was just as surprised as anybody else when things start to shift and change and transitions start to happen at the time. Transitions in terms of trickster energy is like any other transitions. Change, as we like to define it, is something that can just be physical, but a transition affects us emotionally. So when we're in a transition, we're emotionally open to these types of influences, and this constellation of characteristics of what the trickster may be, whether it's deception, whether it's transition, whether it's a breakdown of order, whether it's a blurring of boundaries. This is where it manifests itself most frequently in most reports that are given by people. And I wanted to reflect that in the stories, both in terms of atmosphere, characters, traditionalism, and genuine tricksters. Very few writers of supernatural and paranormal fiction actually deal with so-called what a magician or a mentalist would call a real trickster, because they don't have experience in that area. And oftentimes in movies, books, television shows, the literal trickster, as portrayed in Witchfinder General or in the Game of Thimbles, does not ring true to someone who's in the trade. But I wanted to write stories that made it without giving away their tricks, so to speak. I wanted to create some stories and atmosphere that got a little bit closer to the way it really is, and for that type of trickster energy.
You mentioned in one of our conversations that some of your stories come from dreams and personal experience. Could you give us some examples of this from your book?
Yeah, the some of the personal experience, many of them actually have some personal experience. In my background as a magician, mentalist, and psychic entertainer, reader, as we mentioned before, Lost Days and Game of Thimbles, Spirit Cabinet, and the ones that were literally, the one that literally was a dream, and was Jar Boy, where I had stumbled across in an old used bookstore, which I don't even know if they exist anymore, the way they were. The ones that I've seen in the last 20 years, all this good stuff's picked over, probably sold on Amazon or something. But back 30, 40 years ago, you could find some very interesting books just kind of sitting in a pile in a corner someplace. And I stumbled upon a book called Dwarfs and Jesters in Art, a 1957 black and white photo book of photos of literally of dwarfs and jesters in art. And in the text, it talked about how at different times in history, Western history, Roman history, the Middle Ages, people were fascinated by freaks, and there oftentimes were not, living in an era before television and radio, there oftentimes were not enough of these freaks to go around for entertainment purposes. And so they were manufactured. And so an unfortunate a child could be kidnapped and exploited in this way, which I personally found to be a horrifying thought. And later, a few days later or so, I had a nightmare about this kind of situation. And it was very sort of terrifying and just plain disturbing. And that disturbance stayed with me for quite a while, a few years, and eventually, when the story was ready to be written to get that demon out of me, the story, as often happens, literally just kind of came forth very quickly. And another story that was based on dreams and direct experience was Want Ad, and that is that I actually witnessed the entire story except for the ending, where somebody had given away one of the most wonderful dogs, pets, just a wonderful. I mean, this dog was so nice and so charming. It was almost like a person, as any pet owner knows. And I saw them give the poor pet away to somebody who clearly was selling them to animals to a lab. So for experimentation. This was many, many years ago. And so just the concept that somebody would do this and was horrifying, and as a kind of cathartic release, I wrote the story. So a number of the stories do have autobiographical elements in them, and also dream elements. Western Hero was kind of a dream element as well, where I had a dream where I kind of saw these people from different parts of Western mythology in this saloon, which just seemed to be something that existed apart from reality and was eternal. And to me, it was a much more visceral, as a play, it was a much more visceral production than, say, like Sartre's No Exit. It was that kind of thing, but non-intellectual. It was much more visceral, and because part of it came from a dream.
You were friends with Tony Andruzzi, who published a lot of your writing that was intended for magicians and mentalists. For the benefit of those who aren't familiar with Tony's name, could you tell us a little about how you came to know him?
Well, I'd met Tony Andruzzi. I'd heard of him for years, and I had been writing for my own amusement uh, routines that were considered in the magician trade as bizarre magic. And bizarre magic, as defined by magicians, is that it's really magic that has anything to do with the odd, the arcane, the weird, and it's very close to the supernatural, paranormal themes and stories. Sometimes they have seance themes, haunted themes, that kind of thing, and sometimes a kind of weird tales sort of atmosphere to them. And in fact, bizarre magicians in the beginning were oftentimes heavily influenced by weird tales writers like H.P. Lovecraft and others. And it was quite common to see a cross influence going on there. With Tony, he edited a magazine called The New Invocation. Came out every other month, and he would publish routines for magicians that were really storytelling magic. And that storytelling magic had a bizarre kind of atmosphere, theme to it, which I absolutely loved, of course, because it fit right in with my interest as a magician, and also as a writer of fiction stories. And so I had written about half a dozen of these bizarre magic scripts that I thought might work for his magazine, but wasn't sure, and I didn't know if he was approachable or not. But I ended up sending them to him, and of course he called me on the phone immediately, and I thought, wow, I'm getting a call from the great Tony Andruzzi, the father and grandfather of bizarre magic in the magician community and mentalism community, and we struck up a friendship immediately. We found ourselves mentally and emotionally on the same wavelength, and talked for hours. And this was the beginning of a long friendship lasting a number of years, where we spoke and wrote letters, actual snail mail letters, if there is such a phrase anymore, back and forth before the emails became popular. And he passed away at an untimely. His untimely death was in 1991. So we communicated a lot during the 1980s, talking about these various supernatural, paranormal themes, both in bizarre magic and in short stories. He loved short stories as well. And in fact, after I'd written about 27, 28 routines or scripts or stories, they were combinations of all of the above, for his magazine, I showed him the four stories, Lost Days, Game of Thimbles, Spirit Cabinet, and The Witchfinder General, and he was interested in publishing them as fiction stories in a short booklet, and illustrating them himself, and would have done that had he not had his untimely passing. And I since then had rewritten the stories and revised and edited them, and that kind of thing over the years, and I'm now presenting them now as new unpublished works. But I wanted to keep Tony Andruzzi's introduction in the book, because the way the writing style that was in Tony Andruzzi's introduction was so much him, and reflected his thinking and his attitude toward storytelling. And he was a natural. Tony was a natural born storyteller. I mean, he could improvise. He could go on script, go off script, a combination of both. He was the closest thing to a so-called real magician I ever met up to that time, and in a sense he was. He definitely blurred boundaries, crossed boundaries. He would disrupt things just by his personality. He wasn't like an embodiment of the trickster. He actually, or he didn't mainline the energy particularly. He actually was the archetype of the trickster, rather than playing a role. He was part of the constellation of characteristics, so to speak. and he's one of those shadow figures who is known by a lot of people. Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan, Ormond McGill, the great hypnotist who appeared on television a lot back in the 1950s and 60s, popularized hypnosis. All these people and many, many others, Jack Ruby from the Kennedy assassination notoriety, we'll say, infamy. Tony Andruzzi, actually under a different name, Tom Palmer, actually worked for Jack Ruby at the time of the Kennedy assassination. And as you know, Tony appears in the Warren Report. So he's a shadow figure that appeared during his time, and as a person of his own generation, was connected to a lot of different people and events in rather strange, unusual, and interesting ways.
What advice would you have for someone who's interested in writing and getting published in the horror genre?
Well, it seems like, from what I'm being told by young friends and young family members, that the new generation, the 20-somethings, 30-somethings, do have an interest in this kind of literature, and a lot of it's reflected in some of the television shows that are on. What I think is a tragedy for young writers in this area now, that in that age group, is that there are no anthology shows that I'm aware of, or certainly not very many of them, like the old Twilight Zone or many of the shows that were on in the 60s, or Tales from the Crypt even, which came on a number of years ago, where short stories and this type of fiction could be expressed in a dramatic format. But in terms of actually writing for magazines, it seems like the market is much wider now than it was in my day when I was younger. Because of the internet, you've got internet publishing going on and blogs and this sort of thing, where you could, internet magazines where you could submit your work. It seems like the market is much wider now than it was. Of course, there's a danger to that just about anything can get published and wind up online, and it would be difficult for you to get proper criticism of your appropriate criticism, positive, helpful criticism of your constructive criticism, if you will, of your work. There would be a danger of that, but I would recommend that anyone who's interested in this type of fiction, writing it, would definitely pursue their goal. Try to become part of a writers group that's serious about encouraging it, not just flinging barbs at each other, that kind of thing. That sometimes writing groups can degenerate to that. That's not a good thing. But have a thick skin, keep working, keep writing. Know that some of your stories, the more original ones, are going to come out of your own personal life, your own personal experience. Many of the stories that I wrote, such as The Cave Dancer, I did a lot of what really amounts to folklore research on that, talking to elderly informants in the Deep South, having them tell me their ghost stories and their experiences. And I knew this was all really new material that was out there, and people were more than happy to share with you if you showed a genuine interest in them. And I would recommend doing research like that for any young writers. Don't just rely on television, movies, or even literary short stories. By all means, be steeped in all those areas, but find branches of the tree that are not overcrowded, and make your way along those branches, and through your own experiences and your own emotional experiences, your dreams, whatnot, you'll come up with some new and exciting original work. And to absolutely do it, because there does seem to be a wider market out there and an interest in that generation.
You've been listening to another conversation with Larry Bakken, a Mind's Eye View Publishing bonus audio exclusive. Larry Bakken's book, Jar Boy and Other Tales of the Supernatural, is available exclusively on Amazon.com. Welcome to another conversation with Larry Balkin, a Mind's Eye View Publishing bonus audio exclusive. We're talking today with Larry Balkin, the author of the recently released Jarboy and Other Tales of the Supernatural. In this rare